For most of my life, I felt less like a son and more like an extra in a movie starring my younger sister. Every family event somehow became about her. If she won a school competition, we celebrated for a week. If I achieved something, my parents would smile politely and then somehow steer the conversation back to her latest accomplishment. It became such a predictable pattern that I could practically set my watch by it. When she turned 25, my parents rented an entire banquet hall. When she turned 26, they organized a surprise weekend getaway. By the time she approached 30, she talked about her birthday as if humanity had never witnessed anyone reach that age before. Thankfully, my life changed when I met the woman who would become my wife. She wasn't human. She came from a peaceful alien civilization that had recently established diplomatic relations with Earth. We met during a cultural exchange event where I accidentally spilled a drink on one of her ceremonial robes. Instead of getting angry, she laughed so hard she nearly fell out of her chair. That was the moment I knew she was special. She was intelligent, funny, patient, and completely unimpressed by drama. While most people became exhausted listening to stories about my family's chaos, she treated them like stand-up comedy routines. "Your sister demanded 3 birthday cakes?" she once asked. 3 separate cakes. Why? 1 for photos. 1 for guests. 1 because she didn't like how the first 2 looked. She laughed for 10 straight minutes. For the first time in my life, I felt appreciated, respected, loved. A year later, I proposed. She said yes immediately. We planned a beautiful wedding that combined human traditions with some of her world's customs. Invitations were sent months in advance. Venues were booked. Travel arrangements were confirmed. Even my parents promised repeatedly that they wouldn't miss it. Then disaster arrived wearing designer shoes. Exactly 1 week before the ceremony, my sister announced plans for a massive 30th birthday party. She described it as a once-in-a-lifetime event. Technically, she wasn't wrong. Unfortunately, she also decided it needed to happen on the exact same weekend as my wedding. At first, I assumed my parents would tell her no. Instead, they called me. The conversation remains one of the most ridiculous experiences of my life. My mother explained that my sister was feeling emotional about turning 30 and needed support. My father suggested that wedding photographs could always be retaken later. Then came my personal favorite. "Your sister only turns 30 once." I stared at my phone in disbelief. "Interesting," I replied. "Because I was planning to only get married once." Silence. Neither parent laughed. A few days later they officially informed me they would not attend. Neither would several relatives they convinced to join the birthday celebration. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. For a while, I sat alone wondering why I was still surprised after years of favoritism. Then my future wife sat beside me and quietly took my hand. "You keep looking at the people who aren't coming," she said softly. "Look at the people who are." She was right. When the wedding day arrived, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling abandoned, I felt surrounded by support. Her family traveled across multiple star systems to attend. Alien relatives I'd never met welcomed me as one of their own. They danced, celebrated, told embarrassing stories about my wife, and treated me like family from the moment I arrived. The ceremony was beautiful. The reception was unforgettable. And despite the empty seats where my parents should have been, I found myself smiling more than I ever expected. For the first time, I stopped wishing my family would become different people. Because standing beside the woman I loved, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about us, I realized something important. I hadn't lost a family. I had gained a better one. The 6 months after my wedding turned out to be the happiest period of my entire life. That surprised me. For years I had convinced myself that happiness required my parents' approval. Every achievement felt incomplete unless they acknowledged it. Every milestone felt smaller if my sister somehow managed to steal the spotlight. Then I got married. And suddenly none of that mattered as much as I thought it would. Life with my wife was easy in the best possible way. We laughed constantly. We traveled between Earth and several allied worlds. We argued only about ridiculous things, like whether humans or her species made better desserts. For the record, I maintain that chocolate is undefeated. She disagreed. Passionately. The debate remained unresolved. A month after the wedding, she convinced me to join her interstellar consulting company. Their organization specialized in helping alien and human businesses work together. Apparently, my ability to remain calm during family insanity made me exceptionally qualified for diplomatic negotiations. After surviving your sister, my wife told me, you can survive anyone. It was difficult to argue with that logic. The company grew quickly. Clients appreciated honesty, practical solutions, and the occasional joke. For the first time in my professional life, people valued my opinions instead of comparing me to someone else. Meanwhile, my parents remained exactly the same. They rarely called. When they did, it was never to ask how married life was going. Instead, they wanted favors. One call involved helping my sister move apartments. Another involved fixing her financial mistakes. A third involved listening to a 40-minute explanation about why my sister deserved sympathy after accidentally insulting 3 coworkers during a meeting. Apparently, she considered that a workplace tragedy. I politely declined involvement. My wife called it progress. My sister, however, had developed a fascinating online hobby. Every few days she posted dramatic messages on social media about being misunderstood, underappreciated, and burdened by impossible challenges. One particularly memorable post described her birthday party as an event that had changed her life forever. I showed it to my wife. My wife stared at the screen. Then she asked, "Was there a natural disaster?" "No." "A political revolution?" "No." "Alien invasion?" "No." "Then how did a birthday party change her life forever?" I thought about it. She got 300 new photographs. My wife nearly fell off the couch laughing. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived. My parents were celebrating their anniversary. Not quietly. Not with dinner. Not with close family. They were hosting an enormous gala attended by more than 200 guests. The invitation described it as a celebration of love, family values, and lifelong commitment. I laughed so hard I scared the neighbor's pet. According to relatives, my parents spent months telling everyone what a perfect family they had built. That statement alone was funnier than most comedy shows. I intended to decline the invitation. Then my wife noticed something. "Did they ever explain to anyone why they missed our wedding?" I paused. "No." Interesting. That single word launched an idea. Over the next few weeks, we gathered old messages, emails, and recordings. Every excuse. Every contradiction. Every ridiculous justification. Some were so absurd that we read them aloud just to hear how ridiculous they sounded. One message literally suggested that wedding memories could be recreated later. Another claimed birthdays were more emotionally important than marriages. My personal favorite remained the famous statement that turning 30 only happened once. Together, my wife and I assembled everything into a simple slideshow. Nothing was edited. Nothing was exaggerated. The truth was already hilarious enough. By the time the anniversary gala approached, we weren't planning revenge. We were planning something much more dangerous. Honesty. And neither my parents nor my sister had any idea what was waiting for them. The anniversary gala was exactly what I expected. Expensive decorations. Fancy lighting. A ballroom large enough to hold 200 guests. And my parents acting as if they were candidates running for office. Everywhere I looked, people were shaking hands, exchanging compliments, and listening to stories about what an incredible marriage my parents had built over the years. My wife and I arrived quietly. The moment we entered, I noticed something interesting. Almost nobody knew the truth. Relatives greeted me warmly and asked how married life was going. Several seemed genuinely surprised when I mentioned that my parents hadn't attended the wedding. Apparently that detail had never appeared in any of my parents' stories. Imagine my shock. My wife squeezed my hand. "You were right," she whispered. "About what?" They really thought nobody would ever compare notes. I nearly laughed. As the evening continued, my parents moved from table to table accepting praise. My sister followed closely behind them like a celebrity attending her own premiere. At one point she spent 10 minutes explaining the emotional significance of her 30th birthday. A guest politely asked if 30 was considered a sacred age. She answered, completely serious, "No, but it was my special year." The poor guest looked more confused than ever. Eventually everyone gathered near the main stage. My father delivered a speech about commitment. My mother delivered a speech about family. The irony was so powerful it almost deserved its own award. Then my father smiled at the audience. "The most important thing in life is always putting family first." My wife looked at me. I looked at her. That was our signal. When the applause ended, I stood and politely requested a few minutes to share some family memories. My parents agreed immediately. They probably assumed I was about to praise them. That assumption lasted approximately 15 seconds. I connected a data drive to the ballroom presentation system. The giant screens behind the stage flickered to life. The first slide appeared. The title was simple: "Why My Parents Missed My Wedding." For a moment, the room became completely silent. Then nervous laughter spread through the crowd. My mother's smile disappeared instantly. My father's expression suggested he had just swallowed a live insect. The second slide displayed a text message: "Your sister needs us more this weekend." Murmurs spread throughout the ballroom. The third slide appeared: "You can always recreate wedding memories later." This time people laughed openly. The fourth slide was even better: "Turning 30 only happens once." The crowd erupted. Even strangers were covering their mouths to hide their laughter. Meanwhile, my parents looked like they wanted the floor to open beneath them. My sister suddenly rushed toward the stage. "That's not fair!" she shouted. Unfortunately, that only encouraged people to pay closer attention. An elderly relative stood up. "I'm confused," he said. "Did they actually skip the wedding for a birthday party?" My sister answered before anyone else could. "Of course they did." The room fell silent. She continued speaking. "My birthday was more important." A woman near the front nearly choked on her drink. Several guests burst into laughter. One man laughed so hard he had to sit down. Realizing she wasn't helping, my mother rushed forward. "That's not what she means." "It absolutely is," another relative replied. The slideshow continued. Message after message appeared. Excuse after excuse. Every ridiculous justification displayed exactly as it had originally been written. Nobody could claim it was edited. Nobody could argue it was fake. The truth was sitting on a giant screen for 200 people to read. My father attempted damage control. My mother attempted damage control. My sister attempted damage control. Ironically, my sister caused the most damage. Every time she opened her mouth, she somehow confirmed another part of the story. At one point she actually complained that my wedding had distracted people from discussing her birthday. The audience stared at her in disbelief. Then laughter exploded across the ballroom again. By the time the final slide appeared, nobody was paying attention to the anniversary celebration anymore. The screen showed photos from my wedding. Pictures of smiling guests. Pictures of my wife and me. Pictures of empty seats reserved for my parents. The room grew quiet. For the first time all evening, nobody was laughing. Because suddenly everyone understood exactly what had happened. And judging from the expressions around the ballroom, nobody liked what they saw. The silence following the final wedding photograph lasted only a few seconds. Then everything changed. Guests who had spent the evening praising my parents suddenly started approaching me and my wife instead. One by one, relatives asked questions. Some wanted details. Others simply wanted to apologize for not knowing the truth. Several admitted they had been told completely different stories. One had confessed she believed I had chosen to exclude my parents from the wedding. Another relative had been told there was a scheduling misunderstanding. A family friend shook his head and said, "I never imagined anyone would skip their son's wedding for a birthday party." my wife politely replied. Neither did I. That earned a wave of laughter from nearby guests. Across the ballroom, my parents looked increasingly isolated. The crowd wasn't yelling at them. In some ways, that made it worse. People were simply disappointed. The admiration they had enjoyed all evening was disappearing faster than free food at a college event. Eventually, my parents approached us. For the first time in years, either of them seemed confident. My mother started speaking first. We made mistakes. My father nodded. We should have handled things differently. 6 months earlier, those words would have meant everything to me. Now they barely moved the needle. Not because I hated them. Because I had finally stopped needing their approval. I smiled politely. I agree. That was all I said. No argument. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Nothing. Oddly enough, that seemed to bother them more than anger would have. Meanwhile, guests continued gathering around my wife. Her natural charm was impossible to ignore. People wanted to hear about our wedding. They wanted stories about her homeworld. They wanted to know how we met. Several guests ended up laughing at the story of me accidentally spilling a drink on her during our first meeting. One elderly relative declared it the most romantic accident she had ever heard. My wife claimed it was evidence that humans required adult supervision. I couldn't completely disagree. A little later, some of her relatives joined through a live interstellar communication link. Their giant smiling faces appeared on several display screens around the ballroom. The guests loved them immediately. Within minutes, the anniversary gala had transformed into something completely different. Nobody wanted to discuss my parents anymore. Everyone wanted to celebrate us. Then my sister made one final attempt to regain control of the evening. She marched toward the center of the room and announced that people were being unfair. That statement alone attracted immediate attention. I don't understand why everyone is acting like this, she complained. I honestly thought people would choose my birthday over the wedding. The room froze. My wife slowly covered her face. I closed my eyes. Several guests stared in absolute disbelief. My sister had somehow managed to confess everything without realizing it. A man near the back whispered, Did she actually say that out loud? Another guest answered, Apparently. Laughter spread throughout the ballroom one final time. Even some relatives who had been defending her earlier gave up completely. At that moment, my parents finally seemed to understand the consequences of years spent enabling her behavior. The problem had never been a single birthday party. It had been decades of favoritism. Decades of excuses. Decades of expecting everyone else to adjust around her. The rest of the evening became unexpectedly wonderful. Guests asked to see more wedding photographs. People shared stories, jokes, and congratulations. My wife and I spent hours talking, laughing, and enjoying ourselves. Ironically, the happiest celebration of our marriage happened 6 months after the actual wedding. As the night came to an end, I looked around the ballroom. My parents had their anniversary. My sister had her attention. I had spent years believing those things mattered. But standing beside the woman I loved, surrounded by people who genuinely wanted us to succeed, I finally understood something. Family isn't determined by who shares your last name. Family is determined by who shows up when it matters. My parents skipped my wedding for a birthday party. 6 months later, 200 people learned the truth. And the funniest part wasn't watching them lose face. It was realizing I had already won the moment I stopped chasing their approval and started building a better life with the woman who chose me every single day. That turned out to be the best celebration of all.